Hello world, I'm Nick, and in this video I'm going to be looking at an introduction to the DateTime object in C#. I'm going to be looking at how you can create date times using this object, how you can parse dates, convert them between string and date, and how you can compare two sets of dates. This is a beginner's video to act as an introduction to this area of C#, but it's one that I think is pretty integral to most areas of programming when it comes to .NET. Before we get into the specifics of DateTime, please don't forget to like and subscribe to this channel for more great .NET content. And so let's get into an introduction to DateTime in C#. So the first thing I want to talk about is the creation of DateTime objects. So when we're talking about DateTime, we're talking about a complex object in C#. It's a DateTime which has months, years, days, seconds, milliseconds. These are all properties of this single object. It's not just a static representation of a time or a date like you would see in a string. It's containing multiple different objects within it. So let's start really simple. Let's start by creating a DateTime object for a specific date. So say I wanted to create a DateTime for, say, the 1st of March. So I'm not going to look at time, I'm just going to create a date first. So just like any other object, we can initialize it using var. I can say some date, and then equals new date time, and then we get a constructor that we can use with various different overloads. So here, if I wanted to say 2023 and the 1st of March, we could say the month is 3 and the day is 01. So I'm just going to add a console.readline here so that we pause the console. But if I run this console app, and we just take a look at the DateTime object that we've created. So you can see if I hover over some date, you might be able to see, hopefully it's not too small, you can see the overall date is there in a specific format, the 1st of March. We've got the day is 1. It actually also populates the day of the week and the day of the year, the hour, all these different properties that come together to form that date time. So let's delve a little bit more into some use cases which might be a bit more in keeping with what you would actually do inside an application. So for example, if you wanted to get the current date and time, there are several ways you can do that with DateTime objects. So here I'm just going to drop this down and I'm going to say current date time. And then this is where you can actually use DateTime as a static object. So instead of saying new date time, you can just say DateTime, and then you've got various different methods and functions that you can use for this. So you've got UTC now, and you've also got now. So I'm going to start with now, and that will give me my current date and time according to my local date time. So you can see here, it gets a DateTime object that is set to the current date and time on this computer. So whatever your locale is set to, you can just say .now according to this computer, or according to the computer that is running the code, and it will give you a DateTime object for that. So again, I'm going to run this. I'm going to skip down to this, and you can see the current date time for me is the 18th of September, and it is 6 minutes past 1. It's lunchtime for me. Now you also have UTC now, and this is where we have to deal with different time zones. So obviously, depending on the machine that you're on, you'll get a different time. And you may be writing an application that actually has the code deployed to a machine outside of your time zone. And sometimes you just need a baseline or a standard time zone to work with. This is where UTC comes into play. So UTC is Coordinated Universal Time, and it's a standard time zone that the world uses. In the US, it's often referred to as Zulu time, which is the same thing. It's essentially a standardized time zone that can be used by any region of the world to decide what time it is. Now that is a bit confusing because it might actually be 3 o'clock where you are, but then a different time UTC. Where I am in the UK, it's actually around 12 o'clock UTC, which is more aligned to, I think, GMT, whereas we're currently in British summertime, so our current time is 1 hour ahead of that. Either way, without getting too complex, UTC is really useful as a standardization technique. So it's very similar to, say, when you convert strings, or you look for certain strings contained within other strings. You may do something which standardizes the input, like to lower or to upper, so that everything you're comparing is on the same level. Well, this is very similar. If you're comparing times, you can say the incoming time, I'm going to use UTC, and I'm going to compare that to the current UTC time, which means that you're being, in a sense, time zone agnostic, which can be very useful. So just to demonstrate this, I'm going to put var current date time UTC, and I'm going to say that is equal to the property datetime.utc now. And we'll look at the difference between that and datetime.now. I'm just going to run through these two, and you can see again the current date time 1 UK time and 12 UTC now, because we're 1 hour ahead of UTC in the UK at the moment because it's summertime. So you may be thinking, okay, well, if I've got this UTC time zone that I could use as a standard or uniform time zone for measuring time and seeing if two times are the same, then what do I do about incoming times which are from different time zones? Well, this is where we deviate slightly from DateTime. There's another object in C# called TimeZoneInfo, which you can use to convert an incoming DateTime object to its UTC equivalent. So if I wanted to take the current date time in the UK and convert it to UTC, I could use this. So I'm going to say var converted time equals, and then I'm going to go TimeZoneInfo dot convert time to UTC. And you've also got to convert time from UTC as well if you want to go back the other way. So I'm going to say convert time to UTC, and I'm going to pass in current date time. Okay, so we've got our current date time, which according to this is 16 minutes past 1, which is correct. And the UTC time is 1 hour behind for the UK at the moment, so it's 16 minutes past 12. We're going to take this current date time here and convert it to UTC using TimeZoneInfo.convert time to UTC, and you can see the result of that is 12:16, and it's actually the same time bar a second because we obviously initialize these at different times, and it's converted it. So this is a really useful tool because it means that no matter what time zone you're ingesting with your data coming in, you can standardize it to UTC and then do a comparison with UTC now. Let's move on to formatting dates as various different strings. This is one that I think people use all the time when it comes to software development. It's a way of representing dates in text. Now you can very simply say var current date time string. So I'm going to convert this current date time object to a string, and you can just say to string. So you can say equals current date time dot to string, and that will work. You'll get a string, but you'll get a specific format of a string. Let's take a look at that. So here, if we run that, you can see the default string is 18th of the 9th, 2023, 13, 18, 11. So that's my default format because I'm in the UK, that's how we represent the date. But what if I want to represent it differently? What if I don't want the time and I just want the date? Well, this is where we can pass in a formatter. So actually we can say in here what we want the format to be. So for example, if I just want the string date to be day / month / year, then I can say that in this parameter on the toString extension method. So I can say the format is dd capital YYYY, and that will give me that format. As you can see in Rider, there's some IntelliSense which explains how you can pass in the different formats. So if I start writing, you can see I could just say, give me a short date, give me a long date with a capital D, give me the month date, and then the year with 2 characters. There's lots of different ways you can format your dates. But I want it to be like this, so I'm going to say date, day, month, and then YYY, and that will give me a formatted output. So I'll run that and take a look at what the output is, and you can see straight away it's formatted that string. It's just the 18th of the 9th, 2023, and maybe for my application that's all I need to visualize on the screen. Similarly, we could include the hours and the minutes and the seconds in a certain way. And we could potentially make it more like a SQL date. So I could say, actually, I want the format to be YY dash, I don't want to use slashes in this case, month, day, and I want a space, and I want the hours, and then the minutes as 2 digits, and the seconds as 2 digits, and that will also work. So I'll just run to that line, and you can see there we go. This is something that's more akin to what you'd see in SQL. But it gives you a flavour of how you can format these dates using a string formatter. Now there are some built-in methods you can use besides just toString. So you can also use methods like short date string, and then also to long timed string, for example. But these are all wrappers around those formatters that you'd be passing in. So it's really up to you which one you use. I quite like to use the string formatters because it's a bit more explicit what they'll look like when they're converted. So a recap on the different properties on the DateTime object. For example, the year or the month, you could do comparisons by saying, so if the incoming year is 2023, or if the incoming year was 2020, for example. So you could say if converted time, which is that DateTime object we created, and then just dot year equals 2023. And you've got a piece of logic there that you can use to treat data for a specific year. And you can do converted time dot month, minute, millisecond. Millisecond is really, really useful when you're polling, for example, or if you're checking if it's time to do another operation at a certain time. A lot of the time, those kinds of things are millisecond to millisecond, and so being able to track that at that very low level is really powerful. So I'm going to get rid of that example logic for now. I'm going to move on to comparing dates. So I'm going to get rid of this converted time because I want to have an example of the current local time. So I'm going to rename this to current local date time, and then I've got the current date time in UTC, so a different time zone. And then I want to compare those two dates. So in .NET we have a really useful function called datetime.compare, and it will tell you if one date is ahead of the other or if it's behind the other. So let's use this example where the current date, or the first date that we pass in, is earlier than a second date that we pass in. So we would expect the UTC date to be earlier than the current date because I'm an hour ahead of UTC. So I'm going to say compare date time early, and to do this I'm going to use datetime.compare. Simple as that, and it just asks you to pass in the first date time. So I'm going to pass in the current local date time. No, sorry, I'm going to pass in the UTC time because I'm expecting this to be earlier than the current local date time. Now what this gives us is probably not what you're expecting. It doesn't actually give us a date or a difference between the dates. It simply spits out an integer. And you can see here, this is saying -1. Now that isn't saying -1 because it's -1 day between UTC or date time or -1 hour. It's an absolute result. And by that I mean it's either earlier or later than. So with -1, it's saying that the first date that you've passed in is earlier than the second date that you've passed in. You might see where I'm going with this. -1 would be early, 0 would be the same, and 1 would be ahead or later. So let's test this. If we pass in current local date time first, and then keep it on the second parameter, we should get a 0 result because they're the same. There we go. And if I swap these, so I say first date that I want to pass in is current date time, actually no, leave that as it is, and then change the second one to current date time UTC, we should get a number 1, which we do, because the current local date time is 1327 and the date time UTC, or the time UTC, is 1227. So this is later than this. It's a really nice, quick way to compare two dates if you just need to know if one is earlier than the other, later than the other, or if they're the same. Let's move on to adding and subtracting to a current date time. So you may want to say, I've got a date time and I want to know what the date will be 3 years from now, or 3 years from that date. It's very simple. We just go to whichever date time object we want to project from. So we could say 3 years from now, and then I'm going to set this to current local date time, so that datetime.now basically, and then I'm going to say dot add, and then you've got a choice. You can add hours, you can add days, milliseconds. We're going to add years, say 3, and that will give us the date and time 3 years from the original time. Really simple and straightforward. Until it comes to subtracting, and this is where it can catch a few people out. There isn't a subtract years method or a subtract years function in DateTime. You simply change the parameter. So if you wanted to say what date time was it 3 years ago from that date, you say dot add years minus 3. So if I run this, you can see current local date time is the 18th of September 2023, and then if I look at 3 years ago, actually, because it's add years minus 3, then this is actually the 18th of September 2020, which is correct. So remember, if you're subtracting years, hours, minutes, any time unit, that you add them and pass in a minus parameter value. So far we've looked at how to create DateTime objects, we've looked at how to get the current time, convert times to UTC in order to compare them. We've also looked at datetime.compare to find out if something is early, the same time, or later than an original date. And we've also looked at how to add and subtract time from a DateTime object. I'm going to close out this beginner's video with an example of how to parse strings into DateTime objects. And this is something that I do all the time in my work. Very often you'll have an incoming string which represents a date or time, and you'll need to convert that into a DateTime object in order to perform some calculations. So I'm going to get rid of these lines of code, and I'm going to put something in to demonstrate parsing. So the first thing I'm going to do is create 3 strings. I'm going to create one called DateTime with slashes. In fact, actually just date string with slashes, and I'm just going to set that to 24th of April 2023. Obviously in the US it would be 04/24/2023, but your date time on your local machine would be different, so that would be fine. Then I'm going to do the same thing, but I'm going to add the time in. So date time string with slashes. So I'm going to use the same date, but then I'm going to add a space. I'm going to set it to 12, 10, and 23 seconds. Then I'm going to put together a largely different string format. I'm going to call it full date string. And this is to demonstrate a string which can be parsed into a DateTime object. So I'm going to say Wednesday the 13th. Well, I'm not putting TH. In fact, I think it needs a comma. There are certain string formats that are accepted. So this is an example of one that is accepted. So September 2023, and I'm going to set the time to 09:30, 23 seconds, and then I'm going to put the time zone, so GMT. So these are all strings which can be parsed or converted into DateTime objects. So I'm going to start with the first one, the date string with slashes. In all of these cases, we're going to use datetime.parse. So I'm going to say parsed date string with slashes. So I'm parsing the first one. I'm going to set this to datetime.parse date string with slashes, and I'm going to do the same thing for the other two. So you'll see now that this actually converts these strings into their counterpart DateTime objects. So I'm going to run from the top. We've set our strings, and then I'm going to do the first one. So this will be parsing the top, second, and third. And so there you go, we've got our objects. And so I can now do, say, for the first object, I could say, what's the month? I'd expect it to be the 4th month. So I can say parsed date string with slashes dot month, and it's given me 4. So it has successfully parsed it into that object. And the same for this more complex one as well. If I hover over that, or if I actually scroll to the side, because there's this useful feature, you can see it has actually parsed it. There's no problem with it at all. We've got 13th of the 9th, 2023, 10:30, which is what was returned. And that is 10:30 because it's GMT. Now, as you can see, especially with that third item there, this could be a little bit fragile. How do we know that it will always get passed? And what do we do if it doesn't get passed? Do we just throw a try catch around the whole thing? Well, we could do that, but there is a better way. And it's very simple. What we can do is try to pass these and then take action if it's unsuccessful. So we're using good standards for error handling because we're guarding against an exception that we know could happen. So for example, I could say result for this one. Instead of saying datetime.parse date string with slashes, I could actually do datetime.tryParse. And this is good practice because you're always guarding against that potential unhandled exception that can result from not being able to parse an incoming string into a datetime object. So what we need to do before we do this is to say declare a variable. So datetime result equals new datetime. So we're going to create a blank datetime variable which will contain the parsed value if it's successful. And try parse, we still pass in the string date that we want to parse, so it's date string with slashes, but then we need to point it to datetime result. Datetime result being the place it should go to if it's successful. And also you'll notice that try parse returns a bool, so it will say whether it was successful or not. So we're saying tell me if the parsing is successful, true or false, but also put the result into this variable. And because that's slightly different to how we would normally run functions, we have to use what's called an out parameter. So we say out datetime result. And what that does is it means that we get the result of this, but the other result we want, which is the actual parse date, goes into the variable we specify. And you can see here, this is actually set to a bool. So it means that we can say if result equals true, then we can use it. And if it isn't equal true, we can put some other code in there that actually handles that situation. Now this should work just fine because it is a valid date time. So I'm going to run this and you can see result is true. If we change the string so that it was something that just could not be passed into a string like this, and then run it again, instead of getting an unhandled exception, we should just get false. So there's our bogus string. We say try parse, and that is false. So I would always recommend as a best practice using try parse over just a straight datetime.parse, unless you're absolutely certain that there is no way the incoming data string is not a valid string at datetime. But let's face it, can we guarantee that all the time? I would assume no. So try parse all the way. So that was a very quick and simple crash course introduction to datetime in C#. There are loads more features in datetime that we can look at in another video. But in the meantime, I would definitely recommend, if you're a beginner C# programmer, getting your head around datetime, because it's such a fundamental part of most business applications. And most of the time when we're writing C#, we're still writing business or line of business applications. And so this is really important. So I hope you found this really useful, and I hope you're able to like the video. And if you're not already subscribed, please do hit that subscribe button. It helps me bring you loads of .NET content. And thanks for watching, and I'll see you soon.